All right, so get this. We're diving into the life story of a guy, right? A guy whose life, let's be honest, it's practically a highlight reel of dramatic twists, unexpected turns, the kind of stuff you wouldn't believe if it wasn't all true. We're talking about the one and only Steve Jobs.
And before you tune out thinking, oh no, not another tech guru rundown, trust me, this isn't just about the gadgets.
You've given us this amazing biography to dig into, and let me tell you, it's juicy.
Yeah, we're going way deeper here.
Our mission is to unearth those surprising, those human, those wonderfully contradictory details that make Steve Jobs, well, Steve Jobs.
It's like we know how the movie ends, but we're here for the behind-the-scenes director's cut version. We're going to uncover why and how all those seemingly insignificant moments, all those plot points, shaped not just what he created, but who he was at his core.
And speaking of unexpected, get this. Young Steve was, well, a bit of a handful. Suspensions, boredom with the ordinary, pranks. I mean, who hasn't been there, right? Except this is Steve Jobs we're talking about.
It's kind of fascinating, actually. It's like you can trace those early years and you see these hints of a pattern, this almost instinctive pushback against authority, this need to challenge the norm. That rebellious streak never really disappeared. It just evolved, eventually weaving its way into the very DNA of Apple.
Wow, it's true. But it's more than just mindless rebellion, though, right? There's this story about Jobs in the 4th grade. This teacher, she basically bribes him with $5 to, actually apply himself. $5.
And that's classic Jobs, figuring out what motivates people, what makes the gears turn, and then bam, results.
It really does speak to a certain pragmatism, a willingness to engage, but on his own terms.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that, sure, the money initially motivated him, but Jobs actually ended up truly loving learning.
He did. He was captivated by electronics, but also, and this is kind of cool, he was really into calligraphy. Two totally different things.
Right. And you know what? That's important to remember because anyone who's ever used a Mac or an iPhone knows that Apple products aren't just functional, they're beautiful.
That's not a coincidence, is it?
Not at all. It was the fusion of those two early passions. The logic of electronics and the artistry of calligraphy. That's the foundation of Apple's design philosophy. Jobs didn't just want to build gadgets, he wanted to build beautiful, user-friendly experiences. And you can trace that directly back to his own interests.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. And speaking of experiences, we can't talk about Steve Jobs without mentioning his almost mythical trip to India, right?
Right.
It would be easy to dismiss it as just some soul-searching phase. But reading about it, it really seems like it had a much more profound impact on him.
It definitely wasn't just a fleeting fascination. I mean, think about it. He traveled all the way to India searching for a spiritual guru who had already passed away. That says a lot.
Wow, yeah.
It speaks to his ambition, this relentless pursuit, but also maybe a touch of idealism, maybe even some naivete.
That's a good point. It really does paint a picture of Jobs, doesn't it? Clearly driven, but also still searching, still figuring things out.
For sure. And, the specifics of that journey, those are personal. But the impact of his time in India, especially his exploration of Zen Buddhism, it's undeniable.
Absolutely.
Nowhere is it more apparent than in Apple's minimalist design. That emphasis on simplicity, on functionality, on stripping away the unnecessary, that's Zen in action. Jobs wasn't just building products, he was applying a whole philosophy, a way of seeing the world, a way of being in the world that he learned during his time in India.
That's true. And it kind of makes you wonder, Jobs himself once said that people who didn't share his countercultural background couldn't fully grasp his way of thinking. So how much did those experiences, those influences, shape Apple's trajectory? Did it attract a certain type of consumer?
Yeah.
Alienate others?
Yeah.
Something to think about, right? But one thing's for sure, you can't separate the man from the tech.
You really can't. And speaking of the tech, it's fascinating how the stories behind some of Apple's earliest creations are just as colorful and unconventional as Jobs himself. I mean, we're talking about a time when, for most people, personal computers were practically science fiction, right? And here's Jobs, barely old enough to vote, building the Applet out of his garage.
It's crazy. Talk about a far cry from today's Apple stores. Can you even imagine?
I know, right? And get this, the book mentions he'd hold meetings barefoot. Maybe some sandals if he was feeling really formal.
That's hilarious. Not exactly the Steve Jobs we picture with the black turtleneck and jeans, is it?
Not quite. But I think it's a great illustration of how those early days at Apple, they were all about scrappiness, this real make-it-happen energy. Remember that story about their first big order from the bite shop?
Oh, yeah. How can I forget? It was like, what did they order, like 1,000 computers or something?
Something like that.
It was huge. They practically turned that garage into a 24/7 factory just to try and get those Apple iComputers built on time. It's a total underdog story. And I
Uh,
kind of think that's what resonated with people even back then. It wasn't just about the tech. It was about this pure belief,
mhm.
the sheer audacity of it, this small group of, let's be honest, kind of ragtag guys taking on these giant tech companies.
They're up against Goliath.
Exactly.
And that, I think, brings us to another turning point, the Macintosh. The launch, the iconic 1984 Super Bowl ad, the gamble they took on this entirely new way of interacting with computers, the graphical user interface.
Talk about a game changer. I mean, even today, that ad is still iconic. That message of breaking free from conformity.
Yeah.
But isn't it kind of ironic, though? Apple under Jobs, it wasn't exactly known for letting go of control, was it?
You're right. It's funny how that worked out, isn't it? I mean, Jobs was legendary for being meticulous. Everything had to be just
Very
so.
control freak.
But it somehow worked, right? That tension, that contrast between the image and the reality, it just clicked. He understood how powerful a story is, how to connect with people, not just on a practical level, but on a cultural level. He knew how to start a conversation. And in doing so, he basically transformed Apple from just another tech company into a cultural phenomenon.
He was a master storyteller. There's no doubt about that. But, even the best storytellers, they all face setbacks. And for Jobs, that setback, it came in the form of being ousted from the very company he created. Ousted. It's almost Shakespearean when you really think about it.
It's brutal. It's a pivotal chapter in his story, though, and I think it's often overshadowed by all his later successes. But it's important. That time away from Apple, founding NXT, facing challenges, even outright failures, it forced him to grow in ways he might not have otherwise.
It's true, that whole, like, you have to break down the old to build something new and better kind of thing. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, NXT, yeah, it might not have achieved mainstream success the way Apple did, but that technology they developed, the innovations in software design, all of that, that became the foundation for Apple's resurgence when Jobs eventually returned.
And resurgence might even be an understatement. I mean, think about it. The iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the App Store, iTunes, every single one of those launches was a cultural earthquake. Jobs wasn't just reimagining technology, he was reimagining how we live, how we work, how we connect, everything.
It's hard to even picture the world without those devices now, but the thing is, they weren't inevitable. They were the result of Jobs' very specific vision, his single-minded drive to create products that weren't just useful, but also beautiful. Products that were both functional and aspirational.
And you can't forget about his focus on building a closed ecosystem. He wanted to control every aspect of the user experience, from the hardware to the software.
Right, that control thing again. It all
And
ties back, doesn't it?
yeah, it really does. It was a controversial approach, for sure, but it was incredibly successful. Jobs understood that to truly change the world, you couldn't just build a great product. You had to build a great experience. He wanted Apple products to be more than just tools. He wanted them to be seamless extensions of ourselves.
There's that control again, right? That thread that goes all the way back to his rebellious youth, the need to do things his own way. But this time, instead of pranks and rule breaking, it's being channeled into creating a tech empire, a legacy that's still shaping the world even all these years after his death.
It's incredible. And speaking of legacy, there's this quote from Jobs that I just can't get out of my head. He told Tim Cook, "Don't ask what I would do, just do what's right." Think about that.
It's like he was giving them permission to actually go for it, to not be afraid, to trust their instincts, to push those boundaries, to innovate. And it's clear that that spirit, it's still alive at Apple today, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at the Apple Watch, AirPods, all the Apple services. None of that was really on the map when Jobs passed.
It's amazing.
It makes you think, how much of Apple's success is directly because of Jobs' vision? How much is, just being in the right place at the right time and being able to ride that wave he created?
It's that age-old question, right?
Mm.
Nature versus nurture. But like for a company, it's fascinating. Would Apple even exist if it weren't for Steve Jobs?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. But would it be Apple, the Apple we know, without his, let's face it, kind of crazy genius? Without that relentlessness? I don't know.
I mean, it's impossible to say for sure,
Yeah,
but maybe that's okay.
maybe it is.
I think what matters is that Jobs story. It reminds us that innovation, real innovation, it's not a straight line. It's messy. It's unpredictable. It's in those moments of what if, those setbacks even. That's where the magic happens.
It's like that famous quote, right? Stay hungry, stay foolish. And he didn't just say it, he lived it. And that's a challenge to all of us, isn't it? To not be afraid to maybe look a little foolish, to push the boundaries, to embrace those unknowns, to see those possibilities, even when nobody else does.
Because at the end of the day, that innovative spirit, it's not just for tech giants, it's for everyone. It's about asking questions, about challenging the status quo, about believing, really believing that you can make something new, something better.
Something that leaves a mark, something, dare I say, that puts a dent in the universe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like Steve Jobs.
Well, there you have it. The incredible, the inspiring, the truly one-of-a-kind story of Steve Jobs.
A life that reminds us that sometimes the greatest journeys are also the most unexpected.
And that even a single person with enough passion, enough drive, enough sheer will can change the world.
So what are you waiting for? Get out there and make your mark.
Until next time.